right, you accursed out there. Scott gave me the drum roll coming in. We are back. If it's Tuesday, it's got to be the curse of politics with Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid, strategists, communications experts, swearers of the highest order. Here we are. We're all in bad moods because the hockey season started, and we're not even going to talk about that. In fact, let me start off by reading you a tweet I just read from Greg McEachern, who's a friend of Scott's and mine. I don't know if you know him, Jenny. And he says, is there a rule that podcasts have to meander for 5 to 10 minutes before starting?
Yes.
Yes.
I wouldn't say meander. I would say explore. For example, the guy who came to fix my furnace the other day unplugged my freezer, and as a consequence, all the meat in my freezer spoiled. And after 3 days, I realized there was a terrible decaying first scene of Goodfellas odor coming from my furnace room. So I had to take the freezer out, clean it out, get it cleaned, make sure the odor was out of the house. So I wouldn't call that meandering. I would say these are sharing little vignettes of our lives that help people put the podcast in context. And I can elaborate on my spoiled meat story if you'd like.
Jenny, that story bored me. And I'm on the panel. What do you think listeners felt about that?
I was going to actually take a dig at Austin Matthews because Montreal didn't do well at the start of last season, but he was back for a game, and all of Toronto Twitterverse, and they were all like, he did so well. He got 16 shots on net, no goals, no assists. But God damn it, and now he gets to wear a tracksuit to work because they've gone lax on the wearing suits.
It's the most Toronto sports thing ever, right? Hey, great debut. The team didn't win and he didn't score, but wow, did he ever put up some good stats? Great. I can't rain on Austin. As you guys know, I can't rain on Austin Matthews too much because he invited Benny and some other kids to his box earlier on Saturday night. So Benny actually has a photograph of him and Austin Matthews, which causes a deep source. It's a wonderful thing to be with the Rocket Richard Trophy winner, but it's also deeply conflicting in this household.
Well, I actually have a signed Austin Matthews picture because there was a picture of a game, a Toronto Blackhawks game I was at a couple years ago, and it was found on the internet. It was one of their press photos of him scoring and going like this, and after I think it was Kane did it to him, and there's a picture of me like going like this and looking like miserable with him scoring in the background, and he wrote, "Jenny, why so sad?" Austin Matthews.
Awesome.
Yeah, I left a picture of Austin Matthews behind at the Howard Chuck golf tournament. I don't need that shit in my house. And in any event, I'm not talking about fucking hockey until the Canadiens score 3 goals in a game. So that could be a long time.
Well, fuck. Hello, February. All right.
So there were elections in Alberta.
6 minutes. 6
There
minutes
were
of
elections
meandering.
in Alberta last night. 6 minutes, okay.
6 minutes.
We go right to Alberta.
Chew on that.
Amarjeet Sohi, mayor of Edmonton. Great guy. Good to see him back. It was interesting. What do you think of the results last night, Jenny?
Well, the turnout was extremely, extremely low. And it was evident that conservatives, for the most part, didn't participate municipally. They really haven't. Ever in Alberta. I do think the interesting results that I was looking at was the equalization vote, and we won't have the final results until next week. Is what they're saying, but it shows that it's a bigger issue than Jason Kenney. It's a bigger issue than any of the politicians and chattering class that tried to influence the outcome. That it is something that Albertans are very cognizant of, and it was definitely sending a message to the federal government.
I thought it wasn't that decisive. I didn't see final numbers. I thought it was sort of like 55-45 or something like that.
The last Calgary numbers that I saw were 58-42, but obviously much higher in the rural areas. So you've got a city like Medicine Hat that voted 70%, Red Deer 69%. So we won't see the final numbers out. But considering there was essentially no campaign to support the referendum, it's actually I'm shocked it got as high as what it did. as I said, it shows that that's where Albertans' head is on in terms of dealing with this federal government.
Can I come back to equalization in a minute, or if we do later on? But I just want to go back to the first thing in terms of the two mayors, in Edmonton and Calgary. And, I'm watching a lot of people saying, oh my God, this tells you that the progressive heart of Alberta beats loudly and all this sort of stuff. And look, I think it's great. I think it's great that those two candidates won. But what I like, and I really take Jenni's point about, there's a political culture thing, I think, where Conservatives don't play as hard in the municipal elections as they might choose to. And if that were ever to alter, then I think we would see all sorts of different competitions. But I also think it tells us that our old boss, Paul Martin, was right 25 years ago, David, right? Which is that the schism in politics, there's lots of schisms.
That's of course true, but about what?
Well, the cities. It's about cities. It's about the cleavage. I mean, I think one of the defining and driving realities of politics in Canada is rural, urban, suburban. I mean, is there a more important demographic? The federal election told us that if you couldn't win in suburban Canada and outside of Vancouver and outside of Toronto, you weren't going to win the election. I think, the election results tell us, a lot about how urban Canada votes. And so, and urban Calgary maybe isn't that spectacularly different than urban Vancouver and urban Toronto.
Well, but I think we can't read too much into municipal elections. You guys, the Liberal heartland in Toronto was still in 2010 when Rob Ford was elected. And it didn't mean that it was less liberal in terms of federal and provincial results. So I just think that in terms of mayors that get elected, it is the form of people identifying votes and who are the voters to be more motivated. And Conservative voters generally haven't been as motivated municipally. And I know for a fact they generally don't get involved with municipal campaigns. I almost know nobody that was involved a great deal in across the country municipally. So recently, so I think we shouldn't read too much into that.
I take that point, but the arc of politics in this country, it's an urbanizing country. Suburban ridings, therefore, hold a lot of disproportionate power. And I just think, sure, you're going to get a populist like Rob Ford who'll get elected here or there. You'll get anomalies. But I think, there are realities to, as opposed to people saying, well, Alberta is just like Ontario, or maybe we're not so different, all that sort of stuff. Look, there's all sorts of cultural and political differences between those places. But I think maybe the differences are more narrow when it comes to big city versus not big city.
What kind of obligation do you think, just to riff off what you're saying about urban-rural, what kind of obligation, because I really agree, by the way, that there's such a fundamental difference, and we're seeing it reflected in voting patterns, but the mindset is so different from the large urban centers to the rural parts of the country. Just as a piece of context, back in the early 80s, when the Liberals could win majority governments without any representation from Western Canada because of the seats in Quebec, there was still a lot of consternation, both inside and outside the party, about what obligations the party had to Western Canada, despite the fact that it had no representation. What obligations does this federal government have to rural Canada?
Well, when you form government, you're the government for all people. So there is obligations. It's obviously not going to be as big a priority as it would be for Conservative governments, but I don't think that's really been the case probably since you guys actually held significant rural seats, which was when you guys were still running campaigns with the vote split, and you cleaned up in rural Ontario for example. I agree with you that the urban suburban rural split is very stark. We saw that. We've seen that especially in the last couple elections. I'm just saying I don't think there's anything to read about that in the municipal results. But I do agree. No,
I agree. I moved on to just yeah.
I think there's a bunch of ways you could look at it. If you're looking at it strictly through an electoral lens, you sort of say, okay, well, we're not going to have votes there anyway, so we need to be as anxious about it. But I think ultimately you have to sort of say, it kind of comes back to my attitude on brokerage parties. You either do believe that you put people together in a kind of collective effort, and then you sort out all those differences and come to some kind of arrive at some kind of conclusion, or you fight those things out like kind of in a barefanged way, and you go, well, sorry, rural Canada, you don't matter to me, so therefore you don't matter. And if you want to matter, well, then go get a party that can elect in rural Canada, and then that takes you down this road. People start thinking about it in terms of, okay, well, why don't we just run a rural wants in party, and then we end up in a situation where people are talking more about proportional representation, and when we get 65 seats for rural Canada and they form a block and they demand certain negotiation. And I don't like all that. So, to me, I think it's really important if a government, and actually plays into the equalization argument. I mean, governments that ignore those voters that don't support them, ultimately you're fouling your own nest, because you're playing at dice with the things that kind of hold us together. And if people feel ignored, people get mad. People get mad, people take action. People take action, then the whole consensus starts to splinter.
Well, and from a practical point of view, like from a big P political point of view, parties that have decided to ignore certain segments of the population or certain segments of what we used to be traditional voter coalitions, the Liberals in the prairies, recently 30, 40 years ago, the former PC government in the West, when you ignore certain aspects of the country and coalition, to Scott's point, then it can have extreme long-term consequences that in some cases may not ever be able to be reversed.
I've joked here about losing my abs years ago, and even given progress reports on my sit-ups as I try to find them again. I'm at 5 now. But there are significant, critical, sometimes life and death benefits that come with using something. Our presenting sponsor, Telus, invests in spectrum to digitally connect parts of our country. So especially people who live in our villages, communities, and towns can continue to live and thrive in those rural places. If you need a reminder, spectrum is the radio waves that make your cell phone, GPS systems, and Wi-Fi work. Critical stuff. The federal government licenses spectrum to companies who are expected to use it to provide service. Telus is doing exactly that by bringing expanded digital connectivity to places like Alex and Westlock, Alberta, small agricultural towns that can now grow and compete globally while providing education and comprehensive healthcare services to their families. How important has all of that been these last 19 months? But here's what's happening, here's what's not happening in way too many other rural communities in Canada. Their spectrum is controlled by regional carriers who think it's a better idea to squat on it and then resell it for millions in profit, rather than actually use it to improve people's connectivity. Regional does not mean small. These are multi-billion-dollar regional companies who get billions in government spectrum subsidies. And the fact is, they deploy less than 20% of the rural spectrum they hold. Communities suffer, people suffer. Telus, on the other hand, has the strongest track record of deploying their rural spectrum. Almost 2/3 of it is already put to use. And as a technology leader with a social purpose, they are fully committed to investing the money and doing the work in partnership with governments to help end the digital divide in this country. Go to telus.com/connectingcanada to learn more. I had Frank Graves on just before this panel. I interviewed him for the Herle Burley that's coming out tomorrow. And I asked him how the Liberal coalition differed right now from what it was under Chrétien in the 1990s. And he said, well, it's smaller. It has fewer men. It has fewer non-urban residents. And it's more ideological.
Yeah, I think that's fair. This is your party. You would know it better than me. Did he also say that if the NDP didn't exist in 2011, Michael Ignatieff would have been prime minister?
He has, in fairness, Jenny, he has a reasonable discussion. We have a reasonable discussion about the Ontario results, and I think that there's a lot that's interesting in there. But in any event, I think that I'm a little obsessed with this shrinking Liberal coalition thing. That's why I bring it up. Anyway, let's move on.
Can we say one more thing about it? And I know people who listen to this podcast get sick of us harping about it, but it makes me wonder if it isn't an outgrowth, and this will affect the Conservatives and the NDP just as much as the Liberals, of modern and contemporary campaign practices, right? Which is overwhelmingly focused on ensuring that you mobilize your vote, that you speak to your vote, that the way to win elections is just to get your vote identified and out. And that is 95% of what you spend your time pre-campaign and during a campaign focused on. And eventually that mentality, and that's fine, and I'm not going to argue with it too much because you got a job to do when you're running a campaign. But that mentality then begins to bleed through when you're in government. It makes it easier for you to say, well, fuck them. Fuck them. If they didn't vote for us, fuck them. I can't expend valuable political resources on people that are not part of my coalition. And I think that has, worsening implications. And ultimately it will bite you electorally, but it will also bite you in other ways.
But David, I if I were you, I'd be worried too. I'm worried about the Conservative coalition, because right now it seems we have two parties. The base of the Liberal Party, Trudeau, remains the single best asset that they have, and they still vote for him and follow the Liberal Party because of him. And on the flip side, you have a Conservative coalition that is being held together simply for their hatred of Justin Trudeau. So he is really the only thing keeping both of our parties' coalitions together in the smallest of ways.
All right. He's the gorilla glue of modern politics. He sticks to everything.
All right, Jenny, we're going to keep with the Conservatives, and it's time for our clippings segment. And we all jointly agreed this week that we would like to talk about Robin Sears' column in the Sunday Toronto Star. Robin Sears has a regular column every Sunday in the Toronto Star about politics. And in this particular column, this lifelong New Democrat chose to offer advice to the Conservative Party about how they ought to comport themselves. I'm going to read some selections from this, and then I think it's only fair to start with Jenny. Okay. So the first thing he says is that you got to change the way you select the leader. The selection that best protects a party's values and ensures local activism is a delegated convention, and the Conservatives have abandoned this most successful form of choosing a new leader, and it's led you open to all these takeovers by minority interests. The second vulnerability is candidate selection. Attracting and landing prominent Canadians has always been a key political tool. The slates of recent Conservative candidates have not looked much like Canada. The party needs to find future MPs who appeal to young urban Canadians, and they will need to be parachuted into chosen ridings, overriding local selection of candidates. And their next slate should include, for example, prominent Asian athletes and entrepreneurs, successful businesswomen not born in Canada, and fewer white male lawyers. And lastly, he says the party does not need to fall for the foolish Manichean choice that many are trying to force it into. It does not need to filter policy choice between left or right. The more useful selection criteria should surely be appealing to urban Canadians or not. Why not promote a national service program for young people devoted to climate change programs, an expanded tuition subsidy for students who commit to 2 years of work in rural and northern communities, grants to police services that partner with mental health and racialized Canadians organizations. These are not left-right choices. They are likely to attract new Conservatives. And then finally, he ends with, Conservative Party of Canada is at a crossroads. It will begin to implement these types of changes that he's just recommended and push back on the continuing efforts to further radicalize the party or begin a certain slide to irrelevance. So, Jenny, prominent Asian athletes or irrelevance? You take your pick.
Speaking to end that on irrelevance is a good starting point. I feel like Robin got in a time machine and went 30 years ago and has not realized where the modern political movements for a lot are. I would also point out his party is a straight one member, one vote. We of course have a weighted system for how we elect our leader. The NDP has a straight one member, one vote. They do not have have a delegated convention. So I just find the whole thing completely irrelevant and laughable. I love that I assume that people in the NDP would think it equally cute and endearing if I wrote an op-ed as to what I think that they should do to become more relevant. Their campaigns to pick up one seat each election seems to be winning for them. So I just think there's certain things in there, like the stuff I'm talking about. We haven't had diverse or good candidates since Brian Mulroney is laughable. We were in the entire new creation of the political party, we had extremely talented cabinet members for years. Leona Glucka, Lisa Raitt, Jim Flaherty, John Baird. They were big gets from the Ontario PC party at the time, just to name a very few. So I think it's nice that he wrote it, and I hope that no one in my party is taking much of it, except with a big grain of salt.
Scott, isn't this one of these things where somebody writes something and says, the Conservative Party would be a lot better if it wasn't a Conservative Party, if it was more like a party that I like?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I've written these columns. Where I go, here's what the Conservatives ought to do. I wrote a column once where it said, why does the NDP even exist anymore? And that earned me some ridicule and anger from my NDP friends. So, these columns are going to get written occasionally. But, my favorite part of this column was when he said, they should concentrate on recruiting prominent businesswomen not born in Canada. Like Nigella Lawson? Like, who the fuck are we talking about? It's just... So I want to declare my bias before I say anything more, right? I don't like Robin Sears. I think he's a pompous, insufferable fuck, okay? And I've thought that for a long time, and I went through a period of about 3 years where I was subjected to angry late night tweets where he would read a column I'd written and decide that it was, up to him to patronizingly correct me as to what my assumptions, where my assumptions failed. And he acted like he was being avuncular, and he had some interest in trying to put me on the right path because he was such a wise old owl. I just thought he's not a wise old owl. He's a disagreeable dink. And so you have to put everything I say following this through the strain of, I think he's an insufferable fucking prick. So I understand that my words may be slightly tinged. Let's see. Delegated conventions. Party bosses pick the candidates. Some white dudes behind the scenes ought to appoint some like Asian folk to really to color up the pamphlets, and you ought to rally the country behind a refreshing idea like the Peace Corps, which I think JFK championed in 1961. This is clearly a modern prescription. I love the idea of delegated conventions more than anyone. I love the drama of them. I miss them desperately, but they are in the past. So any recipe for a forward improvement for a political party that doesn't acknowledge universal suffrage of some sort within their party is a non-starter. You're living in the past. You're smoking cigars in a room that's closed, okay? It's over. That's not happening. So it's not a serious effort to offer a genuine prescription. And okay. Get on it, Aaron O'Toole. Recruit Nick Suzuki and all your problems go away. This is a dumb column from an unlikable man, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to shit all over it from a very high height.
Wow. Well, I have nothing to add to that, Scott.
I just don't like the guy. He's just a goof.
That's a mic drop. I'm dropping my Yeti. That's a mic drop.
No, but everybody, like almost everybody, feels this way about the guy. It's something that people don't say to his face. Maybe some do, but the guy swans around like he's the grand old wizard, and he's not. He's just insufferable. Sorry, personal. That pinch personal. Maybe a pinch personal for the podcast. I'll stick to stories about my spoiled meat freezer.
Well, I don't hear anybody taking you on.
No.
Well, as they say in Westeros, winter is coming. For most of us, that means car engines grinding and whining reluctantly to life in the morning, or the uniquely unpleasant feeling of an Arctic wind whipping your jeans against the skin of your leg at 30 below zero, or the keen longing for April's arrival. Let's face it, soon enough, we'll be sheltering in place. But there are people who cannot shelter, even for a moment. The workers up in cherry pickers repairing electrical lines, or collecting our frozen garbage and keeping our streets passable, or first responders. You know, the essential people. Our sponsor, CN, falls into the essential category. Its trains simply must keep running, and running on time, or the gears of the economy eventually freeze. As I've noted here, if you've got it, a train probably brought it. And believe me, it can be tough running trains in the dead of a Canadian winter. Extreme cold is hard on steel tracks and wheels. Ice crystals effectively attack metal. CN crews have to intensify inspections. The railway's acquisition of high-def monitoring technology helps, but still. And it's a big job braking a mile-long train, even in ideal conditions. CN engineers work relentlessly to improve braking technology, including air distribution cars that ensure smooth airflow through brake lines right to the end of the train. The railway has spent vast amounts on locomotives specially equipped to handle winter. It is, of course, all part of doing business in this country. But do spare a thought when you squint through the frost on your front window for the thousands of CN railroaders out there working without respite, keeping the economy moving through Canada's long, cold night. This week, we had something interesting happen. We had a little bit of open warfare about the economy. We had the CEO of the Royal Bank of Canada publicly take issue with the inflation prognostications of the governor of the Bank of Canada.
And the National Bank CEO echoed, and the National Bank CEO echoed Dave McKay's comments as well.
Well, I was going to say that the Royal Bank guy likely wouldn't have done it without consulting his colleagues. And so you have a clear difference of opinion about how consumers are going to behave with their excess cash in their pockets. Are they going to pay down debt like the Bank of Canada thinks, or are they going to spend it like the Canadian chartered banks think? And I put this into the context of Frank and I discussed a new survey that he has post-election. And he asked people to rank a bunch of policy priorities. And the top 10 fall into two categories. All of the top 10 items fall into two categories. Fix healthcare is one category, and create jobs and get the economy moving is the other category. Nothing else is in there. And we just had an election in which the economy was not discussed barely at all, and we have a government that doesn't talk about it, hasn't talked about it in the longest of times, does not have a fall update scheduled for this fall, and hasn't talked about its budget since it released it. The government's agenda seems to be off of what the public agenda is, and if inflation takes off, I think they could be in trouble.
Yeah, I think governments of all stripes are going to be in trouble. If there was a report out today, Stats Canada released a report that in certain markets and for certain products, food-wise, there's been inflation over the last year by 20%. If you're living in PEI and going to buy a chicken breast, it's up 29% from last year at this time. Broccoli and other fresh vegetables are up 25%. And so here in Ontario...
Who does your fucking research?
Pardon?
No kidding.
Who does your fucking research?
I do.
I buy my own chicken breast. I fly to Charlottetown and buy my own chicken breast, David. So kiss my ass.
So I think that, and here in Ontario, overnight in certain parts of southwestern Ontario, gas went up by 15 cents a liter. And so where Canadians' priorities right now is wages are not increasing. So as you know, the government assumes more debt and prints more money. We have supply chain issues. The cost of living is going to go up a lot, and most people are not making more money. 17% of household income goes to food and groceries. It's only second to like rent or mortgage payments. And the fact that no governments have, the government did not come out, and government has not said anything, and really the opposition hasn't said anything either. You've got the NDP, certain members going on about gas prices. It's just shocking. Because not remember, Tiff Macklin came out at the end of July and said to everyone, calm down. Don't get upset about hot inflation. Don't worry about it. It's going to be extremely temporary. And that is, of course, he came out on last week and said, yeah, we might have miscalculated that. But we think that once the economy opens, Canadians are going to pay down their debt. And to your point, David, that's what Dave McKay said is that is not what the banks, not what the banks projected. And he went as far to say, this is going to invoke a lot of bad memories from the 70s when you've got inflation that drove up interest rates. And he said, once that genie is out of the bottle, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to put it back in. But this is going to be a challenge for every sitting government of all stripes over the next year if there continues to be an inflation rise of 4.1% year over year.
Well, inflation hasn't been an issue in this country in over 30 years. And in the past, when we talked about inflation as a political issue, it tended to be double-digit inflation through the 70s and parts of the 80s. But when inflation was a political issue, I can't think of a government that survived it. It's a government killer, largely because of what it ends up doing to interest rates.
Well, and now household debt is at a record level of mortgage household debt is on average. The Stats Canada report that came out yesterday is 68.7%. So interest rates could have and we've talked about this on the pod before. It is a literal could have just a terrible effect for a large segment of the population who are kind of still living paycheck to paycheck. It's 3 or 4% addition on their mortgages is they're dancing on the fine blade of a knife. And so that is why I think governments are completely behind, and why these voters were not talked to at all during the last election. I think it was absolutely a travesty that these issues were never brought to the forefront by any political party.
To your point, David, about how toxic inflation can be as politically, in 1979, my father died. My mother was able to secure, with the help of a reasonably well-off relative, a mortgage at 9% to buy the house that we rented, because she thought that was instrumental to getting us financially stable and secure. 9% was half of what the interest rates were like at that point. And the country was angry. And, we saw a change of government in 1979, another change of government, obviously, in 1980. But, it was a crazy time. Think about that, getting a mortgage at 9% and thinking to yourself, I've won the lottery. I've won the lottery to pay this little. Now, I would just say two quick things. One, I just think we should stipulate, because it's going to get breathless here and elsewhere, where people are going to start to talk about inflation as though it's already a fact, as though Dave McKay is absolutely correct and Tiff Macklin is absolutely incorrect. And we are living in a very weird time. I'm not an economist. All I would say is we've come through this enormous global disruption. So I don't know what's going to really happen. Okay, so I just don't think that we should take it for granted that inflation is in fact going to rise, or that it is now a structural reality. Obviously,
but it already has.
Obviously,
August 2020 to August 21, it went up 4.1%. Like it is a reality. So unless we think that the supply chain issues are going to work themselves out in the next 6 months, I'm not sure how we can't think it's going to be an issue. Do we think that's going to happen? Like the price of construction, the government's not going to be paying down any debt. So I think that I think it would be remiss of governments to not assume that this is going to be an issue. So we're not sitting here in 6 months where we're talking about the next shoe to drop, which is Tiff Macklem coming out and saying that interest rates are going to have to rise before the 2023 date that he keeps referring to.
Let me finish my point. First, we can't take it for granted that it's going to be persistent and structural, right? Which is, it can't. So before we just all base all of our political calculations on that assumption, let's just acknowledge that it's as much as an assumption as what Tiff Macklem was telling us a year ago. So that's that. Second, change is risky politically. Like when things change, that represents political risk. But unpredicted and unconditioned risk change is really, really risky. And I think that's that's the big fear if you're the government, which is that if you haven't started to say to people, this is a possibility and we are accommodating for that possibility, we have a plan to manage it, because once inflation gets into your economy, it's a fucking wrecking ball and it just starts destroying everything that's in its path. And so we have a plan to manage it as compared to just saying it isn't going to happen. And that means that they have to, this government, you talked about, Dave, you talked about their budget. Their budgets have not, fundamentally, their budgets have not really spoken to economic issues. They introduce their budget. There's a chapter in there on economic and fiscal forecasts. And then they move on to what their priority is going to be in terms of spending and programmatic issues. So it's going to we need a different kind of fiscal update. We need a fiscal update that is going to start to condition and warn people about the political sensitivities that arise from the economic sensitivities and unpredictability, including inflation at foremost above it. And that's just not a kind of update we've heard from these guys, an economic update that we've heard from them. And they're going to have to spend some time and linger, not on how much you're going to spend on childcare or how much you're going to spend on fighting climate change, but like on the basic outlook for the economy, what that means, what the risk scenarios are, and how this government is best capable of handling it, and convince people that if it happens, we have a plan for it. If it doesn't happen, we have a plan for it. And reassure people. Reassurance is 99% of the game. But if your only reassurance is to say to people, we've bet completely on the other side of the board that it won't happen, you leave yourself wickedly open politically.
So here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that whether or not this ends up being an inflation problem a year from now, or whether the supply chains work their way out, at the moment, people are feeling it. It's real right now for people. So rents are up. Gas is up. Food is up. Most of the people that listen to this podcast are probably pretty comfortable. But for most Canadians, when the price of gas goes up, they don't get to order in from Swiss Chalet that week. Like, it matters. It affects their household consumption. And so that's an issue. And the only messaging that is being heard out of Ottawa is from the Bank of Canada, which is telling people that they shouldn't worry and that it's not really happening, which is likely to make people angry. I hear nothing from the federal government. I hear nothing from the finance minister on this matter. And the second thing is that Frank's polling told me that people are overwhelmingly focused on the economy these days. All of this tells me, Scott and Jenny, that it's time for overture, turn the lights. Where's Chrystia Freeland? Where's the finance minister? Like, Ottawa needs to get into this fucking economic messaging game and start, A, have a plan, and B, convince Canadians that it has a plan. Neither one of those things exists right now.
As a finance minister, not as a deputy prime minister, not as a secondary prominent voice for programmatic leadership on this issue or that, but as the finance minister. It's time for some dry dust economic talk.
Well, and the prime minister also. He's the prime minister of a G7 country. Like, get the fuck with it. This is what is affecting people.
Yeah, no, he's not that persuasive on those issues, though. She better be more persuasive than him.
Well, they better realize that it's an issue, because they based on the last election and based on like complete silence and the speed of a three-legged tortoise to get this government back and going. I don't think they see it as an issue.
Three-legged
well,
tortoise.
More than anything else, high interest rates destroyed the Mulroney government. High interest rates destroyed the last Trudeau government.
Well, and the next thing we're going to be talking about, and it fits into this discussion, but could be a broader range, is what it's going to cost people on top of this to heat their homes for the winter. You've got the European nations like Germany are very, very worried about the supply of natural gas from Russia, and Russia's basically said you're not getting anything extra until you fuckers decide to build a pipeline through Europe. China's signaled that they're upping coal production. So right now, it seems that the only two countries that aren't worried about keeping people warm are going to be China and Russia. And then you have a second G7 nation, Japan, that came out yesterday and said that is calling on.
They're firing up the nukes. They're firing up the nukes.
Yeah. And that's the whole other discussion as well. But you have Japan that came out and echoed Biden's comments about having OPEC increase oil production. So it could be a very cold winter for a lot of people in this world.
Scott, you got any last thoughts on this economic issue before we move on?
No, I'm a one-trick pony. I keep saying I want to hear the finance minister talk about the economy. That's it.
Right.
That'll make me happy.
I agree with you.
That's it.
You guys just love finance ministers.
We do. I used to go over to Jim Flair, even when we were out of government.
Not enough to name a building. Not enough to name a building after one. You guys love finance ministers that much.
That's what I was going to say. Even after we were out of government, I used to run over there and tickle Jim Flaherty under the chin. You cute little Irish leprechaun, you. Just love you, finance ministers. Rub his hair.
Since Confederation, owning a home has been part of the Canadian dream. For most people, that dream is much more than just a monthly mortgage payment. A home is where we create our fondest memories and where we can truly be ourselves. For too many, especially young adults, that reality is out of reach and it's getting worse. The good news is our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association, or REA for short, has a plan to save the Canadian dream of home ownership. It includes lowering costs for first-time buyers, ending money laundering in the real estate market, and cutting years of red tape that is standing in the way of more affordable homes for families. The AREA plan will lay the foundation for a future where all people can find a place to call home. When we support the dreams of all of us who want to own a home, we're building healthier families, stronger communities, and a safer, more secure future for all. Read their plan at orea.com/affordable homes. So in this long interregnum, while the government is not formed and is choosing cabinet, maybe we can talk about cabinet in a minute. I hear they are dealing with a massive staff turnover. I hear that there's a lot of chiefs of staff that are leaving, a lot of other staff that are bailing out, trying to monetize their position while they still can, as they see the track coming to a conclusion. What does this mean for governments when you get into this phase where you're facing that kind of staff turnover? You probably don't really have many people left who were there at the beginning. You probably don't have many people that worked in opposition. People have a different mindset when they come straight into government, that kind of thing. Jenni, lead us off. How does that affect a government when you've got turnover at the cabinet staff level like that?
It can be a real challenge because, to your point, when it happens, in my experience, it happens very quickly and it happens everyone at once. We kind of had a bit of the problem. We were kind of at the 6-year mark around the time we formed the majority government. So I think that helped us in terms of staff retention. So some people that had been there from the beginning were like, okay, well, we've done a majority now, so I'm going to give it another year or two. But it is a huge challenge. It's not surprising. The rule of a political staffer is tough. When you've got two minority governments, it's tougher. People do want a better standard of living. You become disillusioned. I'm sure there's some of that among people. If you've had people that have been, really based in Toronto and living out of a suitcase for 6 years, you're looking at making making it back up and making it back to Toronto. And so, but to your point, David, one of the challenges also is dealing with staff that have not actually fought in the trenches in the same way that a first generation staff would be. We had a lot of that kind of in the late 13, 14, leading into the 2015 campaign for us, where you have people whose only job in politics has been working in government. They, started
Government.
they started at.
They didn't go into politics. They went into government.
They went into government. And so it's just governments become more bureaucratic because of it, because you don't have people that are sitting there making strategic decisions based on a whole host of factors. You're literally pushing paper, and not everyone is like that, but it's going to be a huge challenge for this government, because I think for the first time, they have to be, for all the reasons we've talked about, including the personal dynamic of the prime minister. They are going to not being as liked as he once was. This government needs to be nimble, and they're probably going to be the least able to be nimble with the contingent that they have, because it just is. It's going to be problematic for them.
Scott, you been in a situation like this before?
Sure. We watched it from 93 to 2006. I think, they got a next gen challenge. And I think, this, lots of governments go through this, and this probably is only of interest to a small number of people, but I think we are, folks that can talk to it, right? Because
that describes our listener base.
Exactly, yeah. But it's people often talk about government renewal and all that kind of stuff, but they think about it in terms of the blood around the cabinet table. You lose some ministers, you gain some ministers, you promote some folks, and how does that cabinet that's 6 years in look different than the cabinet you had originally? But there is the shadow of it with the senior staff as people think about less, and you will taste. I mean, we talked about this before. If Katie were to leave, that would really be the sea change. But you'll see evidence of it already with this many chiefs of staff leaving and other staff, if that's the case. And it's only natural that people would leave over time. And so they're going to have to, either they will have successfully been grooming people, and they'll be able to have them move up naturally, and people will fill up space. And it turns out that they have wide shoulders, and the second gen is as good as the first gen, or all that, or they're going to have to recruit. And one of the mistakes that I think people make when they're in government is they go recruiting from people who are not in government. All right, let's go find policy experts or, subject area experts, and we'll bring them into offices, and they've got wide shoulders. So you end up with a government of senior policy advisors, and that's not what you need, right? I would go hunting for people that are in other governments, that are in provincial governments, that are in mayor's offices, people that know how to issue manage, people that know the meeting place between public policy, communication, and media management, right? Because that's the skill set that's so invaluable that you have to rely upon when you're in government. You got acres of people that can tell you what the best tax policy is, and you may still find
none of Paul's chiefs of staff knew how to work a calculator.
Right. Yeah.
That's not what their skill set was.
Absolutely.
Right.
So I just think, it's a big tester of a government.
I agree 100% with you, Scott, on the recruitment. It's harder, though, in a minority government to go to the different provincial governments and say, give up a job here in BC or Alberta or wherever you're going to, and move out to move move yourself to a different province, a different government, when sure, we think it's going to be a long minority, but we could fall on the budget in 3 months as well.
Yeah, it makes it
right.
makes it harder. Makes it harder.
Yeah.
But still, there's no better job.
More difficult.
There's
more difficult would be better.
But there's no fucking better job in the world, man. Move to Ottawa and help run the country. Work for the prime minister.
Whatever the fuck you're doing in Vancouver is more dull than that.
It is.
No, it is guaranteed more dull than that.
It's.
I agree. It was the best.
Cool.
There is absolutely nothing. There is absolutely nothing like it. I look back, even on bad days, with a great deal of fondness. And
it's a meritocracy. I always tell young people that, you go and you give these talks at university, and I always say, here's one of the great things. You got 13, 14, 15 people working in a minister's office. It's a meritocracy. It's one of those places where it is genuinely a meritocracy still. So the two people who were gamers, they get noticed, they get relied upon. Next thing
How
you know,
old were you when you became decoms to Paul? How old were you when you became Paul's decom?
Probably. Oh no, I was in finance, I think I was 29. I remember I remember celebrating my 30th birthday with him at an event at an Italian banquet hall where
you were under 30.
Yeah.
You were under 30. Try to get an interesting job under 30 at a law firm. There isn't one.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
I don't need to be the most senior partner, but I'd like to be a senior partner. Could you have that for me by Friday?
Okay, so it's almost the end of our show, which means it's time for my good friend Gordon Pinsent to gather the troops.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, folks, who's got a Hey You?
Well, I'll start. I'm going to go back on the economic stuff, and my Hey You is to Aaron O'Toole, and I know that he must feel roughed up. My opinion on his leadership has not changed, but he is the leader. He is the leader of the opposition. And we, based on this podcast alone, there was very substantive economic issues, which generally people feel the Conservatives are better at. And so the best thing to try to do to save your leadership is to show people you're actually a leader, and you're going to go out and talk about what is their number one issue. If I had been him, I would have gone out and done a press conference on all of these issues. If you get a couple questions about internal dynamics, who cares? But you're definitely going to get clipped because these were major story issues. So instead of kind of the daily tweets about World Beer Day and National Egg Day, I think that if the best thing Aaron could do for himself is to talk about issues that Canadians care about.
He's a natural for Egg Day, though.
Scott, what's your Hey You?
Well, in my world, it's beer day every day. I'll tell you that much. My Hey You is to Doug Ford's team, and it's get your guy in the harness. You have an election coming up, and yesterday the premier he's been gone for months. Let's face it, right? He's popped up 2-3 times in the past number of months. The federal election, he obviously wanted to keep a low profile for strategic purposes. He was pretty low profile before that. They've been downplaying him. He has not been front and center. And yesterday he pops up to make an announcement. So we know this guy's been out of practice, and he's making an economic announcement. And there's a lot of attention around what he said, right? He starts talking about immigrants. We need a lot of immigrants. That's his message. And then he pauses and says, hey, we don't want the bad ones who just are here to collect the dough, right? If you're coming here, you better work. Now, that little virage, that little dose of populist Don Cherry has gotten a lot of negative attention. Everybody's demanding they retract it. I hate it also. I think it plays to the worst memes and all that sort of stuff. But there's also people saying, oh, you know what? That's smart politics. He's doing his thing. There's a constituency out. Watch the clip. It wasn't supposed to be something he said. The important thing about what happened yesterday is that Doug Ford freelanced. He was making an announcement where he was saying, we want lots of immigration. We want to have an economic renewal. And then he went off script and said that. So whether you like it or you hate it, you've got a premier a handful of months before an election who's going off script. And he better get on fucking script, because if you have an undisciplined premier, Doug Ford was not really tested in the last election. It was about throwing out Kathleen Wynne. David and I have the scars to prove it. He's going to be tested in this election. And if he's not more disciplined than he was at that news conference yesterday, Doug Ford team, you're going to have a problem. Get that guy in the harness, because yesterday he was out of the harness. You may think it worked for him. You may think it worked against him, but he wasn't disciplined. He needs to be disciplined or he's going to lose the election.
Well, it might indicate a slight schism with his staff, because if you change something on the fly like that, it means that he was reading it, and in his own political judgment, they hadn't sufficiently balanced the message to suit his neighbors in Etobicoke. So he made a on-the-fly readjustment to the politics of the message.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. My Hey You goes out to Stephen Del Duca and his team, Don Guy, Christine McMillan, Brian Johns, whoever else was involved in this past weekend's convention. Good job. It was a nicely laid out thing. The convention itself wasn't very flashy, but it was competent. There were no screw-ups. It worked well. You had a little rollout plan around it. You announced some good candidates that got some attention. You announced a couple of flashy policies that got a little bit of buzz. probably didn't get as much attention as you'd hoped, and you might be a little disappointed by the lack of traction given all your work. But this is the basic blocking and tackling of successful politics, and you did an important part of it well. So congratulations. Good job. And with that, it's the end of the Curse of Politics for this week. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and CN Rail in the Ontario Real Estate Association. I want to thank Scott and Jenni. My God, you folks bring the heat every week. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's listening. And by the way, Elton John has a new album out this week on October 22nd called The Lockdown Sessions. I think you get a free Curse mug if you buy that album. Ladies and gentlemen, Curse of Politics next Tuesday. See you then.